The following program is a presentation of KCTS, Seattle.
Funding for this program was provided in part by a grant from the Washington Commission for the Humanities, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I don't know of a single person in life that I've learned more from than from Terry Pettis. So I guess he'll always sort of be very, very high in my estimation of what humanity ought to stand for.
Well, like everyone else, my ideas over a period of years change. But basically, I'm the same person that I've always been.
And now, our top news stories for August 1953. Peace in Korea. After 3 years of bloody fighting, dead or alive, our boys in uniform return home. A tough surprise to American intelligence. The Russians explode a hydrogen bomb. A coup in Iran. With help from the CIA, Shah Mohammad Pahlavi overthrows a government that nationalized British and American oil companies. Budget cuts in Washington, D.C. Congress supports President Eisenhower's demand for reduced federal spending. Prison riots in Washington state. Violence flares at Monroe Penitentiary, leaving 1 dead and millions of dollars in damages. A red trial continues in Seattle. Communist Party press boss Terry Pettis and 6 other Reds stand accused of plotting the violent overthrow of the government.
Today, Terry Pettis is nearly 80. He lives quietly in a houseboat on Seattle's Lake Union. "30 years have come and gone since he was branded subversive, and Pettis is no longer an outcast. Instead, he's become something of a local hero.
We'll fight them right down to the last ditch, and we will win. We will win.
He's the leader of an organization representing Seattle's 450 houseboat families. He's been appointed to city boards and honored by the mayor for his civic contributions. But Terry Pettis hasn't retreated from political controversy. He has seen much, remembered much, and lived with passionate intensity through troubled and turbulent times.
I think had we prevailed, had this progressive movement prevailed, of which the Communist Party was a part, not a whole, was a part, this state would be a better state today.
I met my brother the other day, I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name.
Terry's story begins in Terre Haute, Indiana, where his father was a Protestant minister.
Jesus was always a matter of love. I never heard anything about a vengeful God, because Dad, I believe, was what you call a Christian socialist. Now, the old Deb's Socialist Party in those days was made up of an enormous number of preachers, ministers.
The famous socialist Eugene Debs also lived in Terre Haute. In the Pettis neighborhood, Debs was so popular that when he ran for president, even Terry's Boy Scout troop passed out campaign literature. After high school, Terry became a reporter and moved to Minneapolis, where he met and married Berta Peterson. They would be almost inseparable until her death in 1970. When Terry found a job with the Seattle Star in 1927, he and Berta moved west. Seattle was a boisterous, lively city. Terry and Berta found its people and politics fascinating. They lived with artist Kenneth Callahan and drank confiscated moonshine the police gave reporters. Republicans ran the state then, and Terry, a pragmatist, became a Republican precinct committeeman. But the Republicans were not the only politics in town.
Sunday night was the night to go down to the so-called Free Speech Corner down in Skid Row, you know. And the Wobblies there had their meeting on one corner, and the Salvation Army would be over on the other corner.
Seattle's radical Wobblies lived with memories of the 1919 general strike and a dream of one big union for all workers.
One of the Wobbly speakers there was a guy, always wore a derby hat. I forget what the hell his name was. But Jesus, he was a beautiful street speaker. Oh, my God. He could outspeak a Salvation Army band. Now, that took a bit of doing, you know.
But the Wobblies were past their prime, and all unions found rough sailing in the prosperous 20s. Then suddenly, the bubble burst.
I don't want your millions, mister. Your millions, mister. I don't want your diamond ring. Your diamond ring. All I want is the right to live, mister. Oh, give me back my job again.
Well, during the Depression, I was one of the lucky ones. In many ways, I was working on the Tacoma Daily Ledger as a general assignment reporter most of the time. But one of the things that I did have an opportunity to do as a reporter is to cover a lot of the stories about the Depression. There was, to put it bluntly, mass misery. Local governments tried with a few dollars to soup kitchens and that, but it was a drop in the bucket.
Soon, there were millions of unemployed. Without public welfare, many starved in the streets. But Terry saw that life wasn't grim for everyone. Pets sometimes dined in restaurants, while people ate out of cans. It was a contrast that tore at his conscience.
It made me convinced that this system is horseshit. A society that has continued to be built on the exploitation of other people shall not survive. The only way it survived over the years is the pouring out of blood, is the pouring out of misery. It's the oppression of other people. It's the crushing of other people. That there must be a more humane way for the humankind to live.
With society collapsing all around them, some people sought personal means of escape. But others began to consider collective answers to their common misery. The Unemployed Citizens League mobilized 4 Seattle neighborhoods.
They took care of the question of eviction, sometimes by more or less direct action. If you tried to evict, they put the people back in the house. With the light company, if they shut off light, the jump switch was a very popular little instrument. I don't know if you've seen one, it's a little piece of metal. If they pull the meter off, they'd slam one of those back and it'd make the connection. The only difference is the electricity wasn't being metered anymore.
Seattle's Hooverville. Here, League members developed a remarkable self-help and barter system, the Republic of the Penniless. What Terry saw in this shanty town convinced him that ordinary people could work cooperatively and run their own lives.
It was a community of the dispossessed. It was a community of people who society had rejected. It was probably the most orderly community or neighborhood in Seattle. It was self-policed, self-governed. But it was a place where people depended upon each other and they built a community.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Roosevelt's words inspired a confidence that may not have been intended, as poorly paid workers began demanding the right to bargain collectively. The streets of America's cities became battlegrounds. Erupting on San Francisco's waterfront, the 1934 longshore strike brought confrontation, death, and violence that paralyzed the entire city.
The opposition, of course, said it was heavily infiltrated by communists, you know, as if workers can't do anything until somebody comes along and tells them, hey, you're starving, or, you know, you're being mistreated.
Scenes of open warfare between strikers, police, and militiamen repeated themselves in Portland, Tacoma, and Seattle. Pay and working conditions were especially poor in the timber camps of the Pacific Northwest. In 1935, timber workers went on strike, demanding union recognition and 50 cents an hour. Tacoma, a mill town, was a focal point. The National Guard was called in to disperse picket lines, and Terry Pettis, then a reporter for a Tacoma paper, found himself in the thick of violent battles.
The thing that I remember most about it from a personal standpoint is that I always succeeded in getting on the wrong side of the lines that were throwing the tear gas for some reason or other. I used to chalk up 6 or 7 tear gas episodes a day. So it was a kind of a gruesome ping pong game of some kind. And, you know, soldiers would be throwing the tear gas to them, and they'd be picking it up and throwing them back. And here it was right in downtown Tacoma, you know, and that gas was going all over. The lumber industry was determined, you know, they'd had a fair amount of success since the war, World War I, when the Wobblies imposed the 8-hour day on them. And they were not about to tolerate another union, but they got one anyway.
Inspired by the gains of striking workers, Pettis became the first reporter in the Pacific Northwest to join the American Newspaper Guild. He organized guild locals on all 3 Tacoma dailies.
And in the spring of '36, we got the first citywide agreement in the United States in Tacoma, which lifted everyone's spirits.
Encouraged, Pettis helped reporters and photographers for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer to form a chapter of the Guild. They wanted union recognition. But William Randolph Hearst, the famous owner of the PI, flatly refused to negotiate. Hearst had crushed strikes in other cities, so when Terry's Guild brothers in Seattle began picketing, he was afraid they were doomed to defeat.
Well, we didn't know that the labor movement of this town was just waiting to take a crack at Hearst. He was everybody's favorite enemy. So that morning, with about 22 Guild people on the picket line, good God, and here everybody else going through. But a few minutes later, here come an army from the waterfront. They were the first. A few minutes later, here come the Teamsters. Beck decided to get on the bandwagon, and boy, they can mobilize too. And people come, the teachers' union from the university, this was August, first part of August, and other people. Well, by mid-morning, that wasn't a picket line. That was just one living mass of humanity around that building.
The shutdown of the Post-Intelligencer sent shockwaves throughout Washington state. Battle lines formed. Hundreds of wealthy women marched on the Capitol in Olympia, demanding that the governor break the strike. To their surprise, they were met by crowds of strike supporters and a governor who thought it best to remain neutral. As the strike dragged on, an angry Hearst threatened to pull the PI out of Seattle. Terry remembers how Mayor Johnny Dorr, elected with labor support, threw Hearst's words back at him.
So he's going to leave Seattle. William Randolph Hearst, and he could drag that out, you know, 1.5 miles, and his paramour, Marion Davies,
We don't want them in Seattle. We hope you leave right away, Mr. Hearst. We don't like your kind here, corrupting our city and trying to destroy this great labor movement. Oh, Lordy, Johnny was really something.
If the bus gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. If the bus gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll. Gonna roll. We're gonna roll. Gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll. Gonna roll. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll.
Labor Day, 1936. With the post-intelligencers still on strike, a unified and confident labor movement, 25,000 marchers strong, filled the streets of Seattle. In November, Hearst surrendered, forced for the first time to recognize a union.
The significant thing to me is this is the last time that the labor movement in Seattle moved as one, showing the power of that. Because these unions, the mass unions that were involved in this, Beck on one side and the waterfront on the other, were already squaring off in an inter-union fight over warehouse. And ours come just at the right time. A year later, less than a year later, these unions were at each other's throats.
Exuberant, Terry Pettis left Seattle in the spring of 1937 for a hero's welcome at the National Guild Convention. On his return, he faced an unpleasant surprise.
At the time when I got back from the convention, my newspaper in June of 1937, the Tacoma Ledger, was discontinued publication.
Terry found his next job in South Bend, Washington, as editor of the Willapa Harbor Pilot. In South Bend, he and Berta led a successful local campaign for public power.
And it was then that we got very active in the Commonwealth Federation and organized a Commonwealth Federation unit in Pacific County.
The Washington Commonwealth Federation was a political coalition formed in 1935 by unions, farm groups, and middle-class socialists. They soon found a wide audience for their radical proposals.
The Washington Commonwealth Federation proposes that the state take over those factories that have been closed and put the people back to work.
Generally in that time, people were beginning to assert that there was a new class of rights, that in addition to the property rights, which are firmly ensconced in the state and federal Constitution, there are human rights, and among those rights are the rights to have a job, and if there are no jobs available, then the right to aid, to help from the government until such time as those jobs are available.
So we went out and got candidates from labor or from farm to run for precinct committeemen in the next election, and filed them, got them, and cost $1 a piece. We didn't want to, they didn't have $1, we had $1.
Organizing in precinct after precinct, Commonwealth Federation activists believed they could use the Democratic Party to advance their ideas. They met with immediate success. Federation members overwhelmed conservatives at the 1936 State Democratic Convention.
So all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, for God's sake, we controlled the Democratic Party. It was our party. We adopted the program.
When the convention was over, the Washington Democratic Party had endorsed a platform calling for production for use instead of profit, expanded relief, and the nationalization of banks, railroads, energy, and communications. Euphoria soon ran into reality, however. Internal conflicts split the Federation. Rival unions and political factions, radical and liberal, fought for dominance. And though many Commonwealth candidates were elected to office, they were a minority in the state legislature, and only their most moderate reform proposals passed. But a determined Terry Pettis plunged deeper into politics, and as he did, he found that many of the most committed and effective activists he met were members of the Communist Party.
I had then become quite acquainted with a number of communists, including some of the communists in South Bend and Raymond and that area. I also had, by the time, made acquaintance of a number of other people who I believed were communists high up in the labor movement during the Guild strike, you know. And actually, some of them talked to me about the party. And the 1938, I remember someone gave me a copy of the program of it, and I had watched people that I thought were communists, dedicated people, hardworking people, and I felt it was something that a person should belong to. Our printer was also a member of the Communist Party, and his wife. We had virtually a cell on that little Willow Harbor pilot.
Early in 1939, Pettis was contacted in South Bend by Hugh DeLacy, who had become a Seattle city councilman and president of the Washington Commonwealth Federation.
He needed an editor. A couple of us went down to see him and talked to him, and of course I was instantly enchanted.
The pay was less than half what he'd been accustomed to, but Pettis readily accepted DeLacy's offer. He and Berta moved to Seattle and began work on the Commonwealth Federation newspaper, the Washington New Dealer.
First and foremost, they were the prime articulators of the policies that we adopted. And second, they were the most earnest supporters that you could ever imagine.
With writers like famous actress Frances Farmer, the New Dealer reached a wide audience and urged its readers to organize against social injustice.
I think the greatest contribution made by us in that movement was that we got people active in public affairs. We helped show people that, look, you can do things. You have something that's invaluable. You have the right to vote. That public business is the business of the public, and that you should participate. That politics is something that you don't do on election day. You work at all the year round. And our organizations in the Washington Commonwealth Federation, I think our greatest contribution, that we made active citizens out of a lot of passive people.
They were the breath of life. It takes a long time to get used to the notion that you haven't got such fights to carry on anymore, or if they're carried on, you're not doing it. It was just the way to live, the way to exist, the way to be a human being, the way to seek peace, the way to seek justice, the way to seek security. You know, every value that social value that a person would have was involved in the struggles we had. We never tired of them. We worked nights, all days, and we never tired of it.
But as the 30s drew to a close, justice, peace, and security seemed like utopian dreams. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, military dictatorships had gained power. Their ideology, fascism, was bitterly anti-communist and filled with dreams of world domination. They turned bullets, bombs, and bayonets on their neighbors. Hoping to avoid war, the Western democracies declared their neutrality and refused aid to the countries under attack. Russia had given aid to ill-fated anti-fascists in Spain, but was militarily weak. Desperate to buy time, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with the anti-communist Hitler, and the Nazi blitzkrieg rolled west.
Many people who I respected very much, idealistic people in the Communist Party, left the Communist Party over it because of the fact that the Soviet Union would make even a non-aggression agreement with this horrible monster we called Hitlerism and Nazism. I disagreed with that.
Despite misgivings about Soviet policies, Terry Pettis still had faith in the world's first socialist experiment. The German army pushed deep into Russia. Terry Pettis and other American communists clamored for American intervention on the side of the Soviets. The Washington Commonwealth Federation was divided, for many members felt America should stay out of the war. Then in December of 1941, Terry Pettis was speaking to a Commonwealth meeting in Tacoma when a man rushed to the podium and handed him a note.
I turned to the audience and I said, this has just come in over the air. I think he told me it was ABC, whatever. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. And it's hard to describe what happened to that audience. I looked at them, you know, what do you say? You know, what can you say? Some people, there was obviously some people started to cry. There was feelings of incredulity. I remember there was a gasp, you know, what has happened? The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
Off we go into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun. Here they come, singing to meet our thunder, and the boys give her the gun.
All of a sudden, unemployment disappeared. Just disappeared. All of a sudden, Boeing was hiring blind people to sort nuts, for Christ's sake. They could do that. There's a saying that, you know, you could get into the Army or you could get a job in war industry if you could hear thunder, see lightning, and eat mush. All of a sudden, the Depression disappeared.
The Commonwealth Federation acted quickly, mobilizing scrap metal drives and support for the war effort. And Terry Pettis, the radical, began to feel like a pillar of society.
It's hard for people I know, I've talked to them, to imagine a war in which virtually everybody supported. A war like myself would go down to the draft board to bitterly protest my classification and demanding that I be drafted. And they didn't do it on account of I was essential to the war industry as the editor of a paper. A few years later, I was being charged with and sentenced to prison for being editor of that paper. The thing that is most remarkable about it is the way that it united people in the main. The terrific unity and a feeling that developed that this was a just war.
During the war years, the New Dealer was renamed the New World. Pettis urged the opening of an American front against Hitler and a renewed assault on domestic social problems. The New World campaigned against racial discrimination and anti-Semitism, supported equal pay for women, championed expanded public services like mass transit, old age pensions, and free medical care. And when the 1944 elections came around, the Federation was ready.
Oh, I was working in the shipyards, and I went down and filed to run for office. Had to go to Olympia, and it happened to be the 1st of May. So when I went back to the shipyard the next day, one of the conservative machinists said, "So where were you yesterday? Out marching in a May Day parade?" And I said rather calmly, "No, I went down and filed to run for Congress." He said, "You did?" Well, it started then. I mentioned primarily the issue was to win the war against fascism, against Hitlerism, and that the country needed unity for this, and to gain unity, of course, you'd have to have a representative organized labor in these high posts. So it was time for us to elect somebody who had calluses on his hands instead of on his ass. And that was my way of diminishing my speech, and of course everybody worked for me very hard. We collected a lot of money in that shipyard.
DeLacy and many other Commonwealth candidates were elected to office. In the Washington legislature, their reform proposals passed easily. And as American soldiers returned home from victories over the Nazis, Terry Pettis looked forward optimistically to the future.
I think I shared with millions and millions of people a hope that this terrible war was going to usher in a period that would be better for most of mankind.
Life was returning to normal in Western Washington. In the spring of 1945, the Washington Commonwealth Federation was abolished. Its leaders felt they had succeeded in bringing progressive ideas to the Democratic Party. But for Terry Pettis and his fellow radicals, it was the calm before the storm.
I remember when that word came, and we first got the report of what this was, and this city had disappeared. I remember I talked to Dad on the phone. Somehow I felt so disturbed. I felt something terribly wrong had happened. I don't know why. It was bleak. And I said, Dad, I am not, as you know, very religious, but you better pray for us all. I remember saying that to him. Never forgotten that.
Franklin Roosevelt was dead, and his successor, Harry Truman, was far more conservative.
And under his misleadership, we began to lose, first, the political structure that we had built, and second, the gains which we had accomplished.
Truman lifted wartime price controls. A new wave of strikes spread across the country as workers demanded that wages keep pace with skyrocketing prices. Wartime unity had been shattered. The backlash came quickly. Republicans charged that communists and striking unions were a threat to American security and fanned growing American fears of post-war Soviet expansion.
This is Robert Trout reporting. And it's definite. This election of November 5th, 1946 has been decided. The Republicans have won control of both the Senate and the House, and by substantial majorities.
My defeat was part and parcel of that thing, and of course the state of Washington, we lost practically every strong position we'd had. We had a strong influence in the legislature, where the Washington Commonwealth Federation had backed 45% of the members of the state legislature, of the House, of the representatives, and a number of the senators, and we had a strong group in there that had been there for years, who were progressives, strong progressives, really fought for the people. In King County, we lost every one of them. So that it really was a clean out.
The Republicans wasted no time in keeping their promises. Washington's new Republican legislature created the Canwell Committee to investigate subversive activities in the state. The committee charged that communists dominated the Washington Old Age Pension Union, the Seattle Labor College, and the Repertory Theater. While protesters marched outside, Committee Chairman Albert Canwell, a Spokane Republican, relentlessly pressed his attack on communism.
The Canwell Committee set out, very interestingly, to attack in certain directions. One, it attacked the university, a fountain, shall we say, of intellectual freedom. Its faculty were terrorized. Eventually, several tenured faculty members were fired. Others were put on probation. and the university was humiliated. The Canwell Committee carried on this witch hunt for about a year. It made a report to the legislature, which the legislature never adopted. The legislature never recreated it. But nevertheless, there was the opening gun for what became, and nationwide, an era of repression.
It isolated people who had been leaders, progressive leaders in times past. There were like Tom Rabbitt, who was a state senator, and Bill Pennock, and many others who had been active in the state legislature and were picked up by the committee and interrogated and discredited to the point where many people who called themselves friends of these people before wouldn't even talk to them anymore, didn't want to be seen with them. It might endanger them. They might lose their jobs.
Though already dead, the Washington Commonwealth Federation was a special Canwell target. And as evidence of considerable communist influence in the Federation mounted, many former members rushed to disavow their activities. But Terry Pettis was not one of them.
We have nothing to apologize for. A movement was first raised the issue of fair employment for equal pay for equal work for women. That was back in the 30s. That introduced and fought and got into the legislature the first fair employment practices law in the early 40s. An organization that fought for and got one of the best old age pension programs in the 40s. The first state that got a medical and health program, not only for old people, but later extended it to people who were on relief and to ADC mothers. Apologize for that.
Desperate to stop the onrushing Cold War, progressives formed a new party in 1948.
I am committed to stopping the creation of fear, to using all my powers to prevent the fear makers from clogging the minds of the people with the red issue.
But on Election Day, Truman beat Dewey, and Henry Wallace got less than 1 million votes.
I met my brother the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name. Now do you call that a brother? No, no. You call that a brother? No.
A feverish anti-communism swept America. Celebrated black artist Paul Robeson, who sang on Union picket lines and befriended known communists, was attacked by hostile crowds.
My sister the other day, I gave her my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, she too scandalized my name. Now do you call that a sister? No, no, you call that a sister?
And when Robeson asked his old friend Terry Pettis to arrange a concert for him in Seattle, Pettis met with fierce opposition from conservative unions.
Mr. Robeson, as I told these gentlemen there, probably has more honorary membership in the trade union movement than any man in the country. His life had been devoted to the trade union movement. And here they were attempting to sabotage his concert.
1950 brought war against communist armies in Korea and trials of leading American communists on charges of treason. It was dangerous to be a radical of any stripe, especially in a city as dependent on the military as Seattle.
Yes, we have security in the sky.
But Terry Pettis wasn't hiding. He had become an editor of a Communist Party paper, The People's World. The Communist Party was especially active then in fighting racial discrimination, attracting idealistic young civil rights activists like Paul Bowen, a Boeing technician.
The fight for trade union principles, the fight for fair housing, the fight for human decency, one towards the other. Now, these very deep-going humanistic interests captured my young imagination at the time, and I thought that this was worth devoting at least a measure of my life to.
In the summer of 1952, as Seattle celebrated its centennial, Terry Pettis and Paul Bowen were arrested by FBI agents. They and 5 co-defendants were charged with conspiring to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. John Coughlin was one of their lawyers.
The Communist Party in the late 40s and 50s was scarcely going around advocating the overthrow of the government by force and violence. What it was doing was opposing the McCarthy period, opposing the involvement of the United States in the Korean War.
Ironically, at that time, the Communist parties had membership cards and had the printed Constitution, which they gave everybody. It's the only, that Constitution was never amended until as long as I was in the Communist Party. One of the reasons that you could get expelled was to advocate the violent overthrow of the government.
Prosecution witnesses charged that even though the defendants had never actually advocated violence, communist doctrine and activities in other countries were evidence of intent.
It was ridiculous. You had people, for example, testifying against Terry Pettis and another co-defendant, Paul Bowen, who were testifying about things that happened before Paul Bowen was even born, and when Terry Pettis was 5 or 6 years old.
There was no such thing as a conspiracy to do anything. Yes, I entered into an agreement with people to picket the Safeway store here in 1947, 48, the Tradewell stores, both companies which sought to keep blacks out of employment in basically all black communities. Apparently this is why the government felt that I was dangerous and that I was somehow threatening the establishment.
The trial drove defendant William Pennock to his grave through an overdose of sleeping pills. A week after Pennock died, Terry Pettis took the witness stand.
Terry Pettis was a particular target because he was an editor, a publicist, a writer, and a very effective one.
Pettis argued that he believed in American democratic freedoms and was opposed to violence.
I told the jury and the judge that I hoped if there ever a time came in the United States where a government deprived the American people of their basic and fundamental constitutional and democratic rights, I hoped I would have the courage to take up arms against them.
The examination or cross-examination of the prosecutor in these cases always consisted of just one series of questions. Who else was a member of the Communist Party along with you? Well, the minute you name someone else under those circumstances, you're involving them in the possibility of all sorts of harassment, of terror, and so forth. So naturally, those who testified refused to identify others.
My position to the court was that I would discuss any of my activities and affiliations. I would discuss any activities with my co-defendants, but I would not talk about other people.
The judge immediately, although knowing this was going to happen, sentenced them at once to spend all the rest of the time of the trial in jail, and Terry spent almost 60 days in jail while the trial was in progress.
Paul Bowen told the court he joined the Communist Party because of its commitment to civil rights.
And as I spoke to the jury, the prosecutor was busy taking notes and of course raised his voice and says, "Yes, but Paul Bowen, you want these rights now." And my rejoinder was, "No, I wanted them yesterday. Now it's too late." I felt chagrined and angry that the prosecutor had the nerve to question my requirement of human rights, human dignity, and decency now.
The trial lasted 6 months. 15,000 pages of evidence and testimony led to the verdict. Terry Pettis and his co-defendants faced a frightening future. Released from jail on appeal, they had lost jobs, friends, honor, even a life. Five years passed, and with them, the threat of prison. An appeals court overturned the convictions. But government attacks had crushed the Communist Party, leaving it isolated and internally rigid. In 1958, Terry Pettis decided it was time to leave the party. He settled down with Berta in their houseboat and earned a meager living writing detective stories for magazines. He had spent 20 years immersed in politics and needed a vacation. But he wouldn't be out of the limelight for long. Lake Union, in the shadow of downtown Seattle, is home to a colorful colony of houseboats, one of the city's most picturesque attractions. It is a place of pride and neighborly spirit, unique and diverse. But Lake Union wasn't always as clean as it is today. "20 years ago, this was a threatened community. Lake Union was dying from pollution. But once again, Terry Pettis became an activist. He organized the Floating Homes Association to represent the concerns of houseboaters and persuaded his neighbors to take the first steps to clean up the lake.
So we started to work with the city council to try to solve the problem. There was no sewer around this lake. There should have been one 60, 70 years ago. Houseboats are very visible, so people always said, look at those houseboats, they're polluting this nice lake. They didn't realize that around the lake, all of the buildings were also dumping directly into the lake. But worst of all, when we examined the problem with the health department of Lake Union and its water pollution, we discovered that the city had 13 sewer outfalls into this lake. It was a lesson to us, and fortunately, you had a city government that would listen.
What we're attempting to do with the lake is to find ways of reconciling the legitimate private interests of the property owners and the very legitimate public interest. It's a natural resource which was given to this city by probably the Ice Age, and it's something that is to be shared and utilized.
Terry Pettis led the Floating Homes Association in fight after fight, stopping freeways from cutting Lake Union off from the rest of the city, stopping giant waterfront condominiums from pushing out the houseboats, controlling rents on the houseboat moorages, and building parks where people could enjoy the lakeshore.
We, in a sense, saved Lake Union. And I'm proud of the houseboat people because they accepted the fact that we could not wage a battle just for houseboats on a very narrow issue of houseboats. That what we had to do was concern ourselves first with the entire lake because that is our community and it's something that belongs to all the people. This movement led to the enactment of the Shorelands Management Act, in which we protect all of the shorelands of our state. These things, to me, are very important. It seems to me that anyone who calls themselves a progressive or a radical is not concerned with the physical and well-being, with the preservation of these natural resources. They're simply not doing their job.
They don't call Terry Pettis Mr. Floating Homes for nothing. In fact, if it weren't for Terry Pettis, there wouldn't be any floating homes in Seattle. There's just been an incredible number of things that have happened that could have destroyed the floating homes community. And one by one, Terry has responded to them, organized the community, and overcome the problems. I think we owe him a tremendous debt.
The city of Seattle has named next Sunday Terry Pettis Day. Usually, the city of Seattle is about as discriminating as an epidemic of measles when it comes to those special days, which is to say nearly anyone can get one, and not everybody always wants them. You know, there is something monumentally inane to set aside time or days for people. National Peanut Butter Week, National Be Nice to Your Dog Catcher Day. But finally, the city has demonstrated a little class with a day for Terry Pettis. Now, you must understand the irony of all of this, the beautiful, bittersweet irony. A day for Terry 45 years ago, probably the entire establishment of this city would not have minded at all if someone had shot Terry and dumped him in his beloved Lake Union.
It was over 40 years ago that Woody Guthrie and I first came to Seattle. We called ourselves the Almanac Singers, had an old Buick that got 7 miles for the quart of oil. We came up here because we heard of an outfit called the Washington Commonwealth Federation. And a young fellow named Terry Pettis was working for it, getting things to organize, and Hugh DeLacy was going to run for Congress in a few years. We wanted to find out what was going on up here. And they arranged for us to sing some songs at the local union halls, and this was one of the songs we sung. Just some new words that Woody had put to an old tune.
His dedication, know-how, and eloquence has inspired others to follow in his footsteps. And whereas he has demonstrated wisdom and the courage to speak out whenever the quality of life in our city has been threatened. And whereas his community mindedness and experience have led to his appointment and service on such public bodies as the Board of Adjustment and the Advisory Committee on the Shoreline Master Program, where we really need Terry today. And whereas he has single-handedly spearheaded the fight to preserve and protect the floating homes community in Seattle and the diversity and vitality of Lake Union, and whereas his sense of history provides us with a link to our city's past and a vision to its future, now therefore I, Charles Royer, Mayor of the City of Seattle, do proclaim March 7, 1982 as Terry Pettis Day in Seattle. Terry, thank you.
I just want to say very little tonight, but I want to do 2 things. One, I am not a candidate for a public utility district commissioner, and I want to disapprove of the story that I actually walked across Lake Union. That much for the humor. The other thing is tonight, I feel it's almost impossible when anyone finds Terry Pettis short of words that sure as hell something has happened, all right. But the only void I feel tonight is the absence of Berta. So many people have said these things, nice things about me, but it was really saying it about 2 people. For more than 40 years, she was a part of all of the things that we were able to do together. And I miss her very much tonight. The other thing I want to say is this. I'm privileged to have lived in a caring community like our lake. And I love you all, and thank you.
In recent years, Terry Pettis has turned his political energies to problems closer to home. But when 15,000 demonstrators filled Seattle Center to protest the arms race, Terry was with them. He feels there is no cause more important now than preventing nuclear war.
What does disturb me is looking around at young people and at future generations, that we have the power today to deprive them of that great and marvelous thing called life and the experience of life. And it's very real.
Despised in one era, honored in another, Terry Pettis has led an active, committed life, carried or battered by the changing winds of public opinion. He has come in from the rain now, living quietly between walls covered with memories and hundreds of books. But though his ideas may have changed somewhat over the years, his heart still holds to a youthful dream.
Well, if I had my druthers, I would say that sometime, you know, they'd say this great movement that did something that has never been done in the history of society, and that is that people became so conscious of their interdependence upon each other, so conscious of the power that they have collectively, that they would create a society, a sharing society, a society that eliminated as near as we could all privilege and tried to eliminate all of the ills that can be eliminated from society, a society in which people as a group had control over their own lives. And we've never had that. That was the dream of the old Deb socialist movement, the so-called democratic socialist movement. It was never articulated completely. But someday, I think the most radical thing that people could do would be to give real, true democracy. That is, to give democracy a chance. We've never tried it yet. It's worth trying. You know, old Joe Hill, the IWW member, a songwriter who was executed. Before he died, he sent a telegram to the headquarters in Chicago, said, "Don't mourn, organize." That was a wise thing to do, and I would love to be able to be remembered as those are my last words.
Funding for this program was provided in part by a grant from the Washington Commission for the Humanities, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The preceding program was a production of KCTS Seattle.